Welcome to the discussion, Breaking Out of Australia's Neoliberal Straitjacket, the People's Economic Alternative Project. Our speakers on this subject is Dr. Tom Skladzien. He's a Australian-US trained economist. He has worked in academia, federal treasury, and as a ministerial advisor primarily to Minister Corbett, and now works as the national economist for the AMWU, the Australian Metal Workers Union. He was instrumental in drafting the AMWU Alternative Economic Agenda paper that was central in starting the ball rolling on the Common Action People's Agenda initiative, and which included 10 principles to underpin an alternative agenda.
My name is Tom Skladzien. I'm the National Economics Advisor of the AMWU. I was actually going to be a little bit indulgent and talk about myself for the first couple of minutes because it's relevant to the topic. So, by way of introduction and by way of starting my talk, I was always interested as a child in the world and how the world worked. This, I'm going to talk about why that is, but needless to say, it led to an interest in history and literature and a whole range of things. I came, like most people come, to a point in life where you have to make a decision about what you're going to study, and the way it's framed at the time, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? And I quickly came to the realization that being a history professor, as glamorous as it might be and as financially secure as it might be, probably wasn't for me. I'd had the benefit of studying a little bit of economics in high school, and I thought economics was a nice thing to study. For the first of all, because at least theoretically, it is about how the world works, how the world does work, and how the world should work. And second of all, there was a prospect of more career choice at the end of such study, and a history degree. And so off I went to university. Undergraduate economics, for those of us who have had the shall we say, with inverted commas, pleasure of doing that, can be very, very dry and very, very boring and very mind-numbing. And it turns out I've stumbled across why that is. Because for the first 3, even 4 years of studying economics at university, and this I'm sure isn't true if you study political economics in Frank's department, but studying, neoclassical, standard orthodox economics, for those years, you essentially study two things. Why markets are the best way to allocate anything in the world, why they work, why they're essentially a perfect allocation mechanism, and concurrently, all the arguments between people about macroeconomics. And Frank touched on this, Keynes and Friedman, and what's the role of demand, what's the role of supply, and the rest of that. None of that gets resolved. Needless to say, those years of study were somewhat trying for me. I spent a lot of time playing chess on the math lawns and in the Adelaide University bar. But at the end of that, I was strongly encouraged to do a PhD. And more than just do a PhD in the United States. The reason for that was given to me. In the United States, you do years of graduate coursework before you do a dissertation. And that's very important if you really want to understand economics, because you don't actually cover those years of graduate or that material unless you do a US PhD. Now, that's not necessarily the case anymore, but it certainly was the case when I was studying. So off I went to the United States to do a PhD. Very exciting time and the rest of it. I landed in St. Louis. St. Louis is a city that has suffered very harshly from deindustrialization, from a whole raft of social and economic ills over many decades. And I got an education in the United States. And that education was twofold. The first part of the education was the economics, the coursework. Very quickly, I became interested in a question that is just ignored in most economics degrees. What happens when markets fail? What happens? How do markets fail? How often do they fail? In what ways can they fail? Can you fix them? Should you fix them? What's the cost of fixing them? All of the relevant questions that you would think somebody who held the job of Treasury Secretary would be an expert at are the ones that you ask and attempt to answer in public economics. They're not the questions that people actually ask and answer in the vast majority of economic disciplines or fields and degrees. At the same time as I was doing that work, I was living in pretty much a ghetto in St. Louis. In the United States, it's not uncommon for good universities to be situated in the middle of very bad neighborhoods. There was a degree of desperation, a degree of poverty, a degree of disenfranchisement, just people on the real fringes and beyond the fringes of society that I had never seen in Australia. I'd never even really imagined. I mean, I knew that there were people who were suffering out there, and it was always a very theoretical concept to me. But when I started spending Christmases with homeless people, because coming back to Australia for Christmas is a little bit too expensive for a poor foreign graduate student, it starts to affect you. And it starts to affect you, and when you're studying markets failing and economies failing for people at the same time, then I think it's probably like some type of virus that gets in your mind. Because ever since then, these questions and these issues have been at the forefront of my mind. I've been very fortunate in a career since I came back from the States that's allowed me to explore and work in relevant areas to these questions, and I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to be here to talk to you about them. But anyway, back to the point. So Frank talked a little bit about what is the problem with the economy. What's the problem with the economy right now? And there are lots of problems with the economy. We can talk about Australia, we can talk about the rest of the world. People are worried. There's probably, in terms of professional economists, and especially academic economists, there's probably not been this much worry about future growth prospects, for example, for many, many years, if not decades. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit deeper, a little bit underneath that. Because, and I suspect Frank would agree, the problems that we see in the economy, I suspect are actually symptoms of a bigger problem. They're not the start nor the end of our problems. Sustainability is one, right? So, what are these deeper problems with how we think about the economy, how economists advise on the economy, how governments approach policy when it comes to the economy? And at the broadest level, I actually think it's very, very simple. And it's a little bit glib to use this line, but I think it does summarise it very well. The economy is there to serve the people. It is not the other way around. We live in a society, or in a world indeed, where it's very easy to think that it is the other way around. We need to be more efficient, we need to be more flexible, we need this and we need that. Why? Well, there are these goals, there are these markers of progress that we have. My favourite one is GDP. Right? GDP is the ultimate, the preeminent marker of our success as a society and as an economy. Of course, it's a terrible, terrible measure of progress, and we've known that for many, many years. The guy who invented GDP knew that, and he warned, this should be used to estimate how many tanks we can build to defeat the Nazis. It should not be used as a measure of progress. But of course, we went off and we use it as a measure of progress ever since. And the reason is very simple. It's one nice, neat little number, right? Now, I'm not going to, nor can I, my memory isn't that good, recite Robert Kennedy's critique of GDP in 1968. But if you're not familiar with it, I strongly urge you to read it. He lists what GDP does measure, and he lists what GDP doesn't measure. And he concludes by saying, in short, GDP measures everything about our society except that which makes us proud to be members of that society. And I think that's actually pretty much true. GDP is just one thing, and yet, you know, I could, but I won't, go through a laundry list of my favourite examples. One other thing is probably worth mentioning, and that's when we talk about specific reforms, how those reforms are phrased. And I've mentioned this in this room before. Take paid parental leave. Why is paid parental leave a good thing? Because it increases female participation in the labour force. Ergo, labour, ergo output. That's why it's a good thing. We're never told paid parental leave is a good thing because it allows a mother to spend those first few months, heaven forbid years, with a child, and that interaction, that support, that parenting has a huge impact on that child's life, let alone the mother and the rest of the family and the neighbours and everybody else in society. But on that child, it is hugely important, but we don't talk about that. That's not a reason for paid parental leave. Paid parental leave is about improving labour market participation. Because if you're not working, then what are you doing? But you know, the point there isn't actually paid parental leave. The point is how we think about policies, how we think about what it is the government should do. And the fundamental point is the way that we think about economics and the economy is not in terms of people's well-being, it is in terms of the economy itself. And we do this because proxies are easy. It is much harder to try and measure and to try and improve people's actual well-being than it is to improve a profit ratio or gross domestic product or exports or something like that, right? And they're easy, and the political discourse is formed around them because it's very hard to talk to people like adults, you know, as we've seen. And we've, you know, slow diversion, Malcolm's come and he said that he's going to talk to people like adults. I haven't paid that close attention, but I think that was the best example of him talking to people like adults. I haven't seen much of talking to people like adults since then. Maybe I'm just not paying enough attention, but I remain sceptical. Now, I don't think I need to labour the point of there is a problem in terms of how we think about economics and how governments approach economic policy. All that Frank said about, you know, the structure of the economy, deindustrialisation, problems with growth, sustainability, I think that's all correct. But I will resist the relatively large temptation of talking about it ad nauseam. What I will do instead is talk about, well, if there's a problem, and that's essentially what we're here to talk about, this problem, the neoliberal straitjacket. I suspect that's what we mean by the neoliberal straitjacket. Markets are a relatively good allocation mechanism. That's my belief, my view. I have studied markets in a theoretical way, certainly, more than most people should ever have to, and I come to that view. But I stop at the point of saying that makes them somehow semi-divine, or even divine. And it certainly doesn't mean that they can't fail, and that they can't fail largely, and that they don't fail. It worries me when I think about policies and governments, whether it's here or whether it's overseas, taking a very clean, simple model of the world, which is a neoclassical model of economics, and applying it to the problems that we face. I think it's right that most of those problems are a result of not thinking about issues, not thinking about challenges broadly enough. Climate change is a perfect example. Right? If you are a business and you produce carbon emissions, why on earth would you want to have to pay for them? Of course you don't want to pay for them. And you are absolutely right when you say to the government and when you say to society, that will hurt our profits, and maybe we won't be able to hire as many workers, and maybe workers won't have as high wages. This isn't a problem of economics, the discipline. This is a problem, in my humble view, of people taking a very simple lesson from economics and applying it to a very complicated world. The simple fact is, and the economics of it is, well, there's a social cost. We all bear a social cost because of climate change. We can either bear that social cost, or we can avoid that social cost and compensate the polluters for avoiding that, or we can make them pay for the social cost that they're causing. From an economic point of view, those last two options don't differ much. From an equity and rights point of view, they couldn't differ any more, because one of them says we have a right to a climate that isn't being degraded, making the world much more dangerous, let alone potentially catastrophic place. And so the point being that the fundamental belief that markets will solve all of our problems, and that where there are market imperfections, governments can't step in because the cost of government intervention is too high, higher than the cost of the problem, is obviously wrong. And I don't think you need to go anywhere past climate change to explain that. Right? Now, there's a different type of challenge which I've been thinking about recently, as have many, many others and many brighter people than myself. If we believe the artificial intelligence researchers, there is a decent probability that in 20, 30, 40 years from now, 70% of the labour force will be obsolete. Obsolete in a very fundamental sense, that they can't do much to add value unless it's cleaning, but then everybody can't be a cleaner. We have a fundamental, potentially a fundamental problem in terms of how the economy will function because of technological change that's always been there and we've always somehow managed, but right now, because technological change has been exponential in the last 30 years or so, serious people are seriously contemplating a fundamental change to how society and how the economy works. There is no free market solution to that problem. The free market solution to that problem is a huge chunk of society doesn't have an income. If you don't have an income, then a whole bunch of other things follow, which isn't worth talking about, not least because it's depressing, but because it's a very long list. A solution to that cannot come from the same mindset. And I'm not going to, personally I don't like the term neoliberal for various reasons. I have an aversion to big terms generally, but from that mindset, all we need to do is free markets. We know what happens. So, what is the solution? What is the solution to these problems? And these problems are, in a sense, two types. There's the actual policy issues, the actual policy problems, climate change, workers' rights, the rest of them. And then there is the question of how we talk about them and how we think about them. And I have come to the conclusion we can't do the former without addressing the latter. We need to talk about economics and the economy and society in terms of people's well-being, people's lives, people's safety, their security, the strength of their communities, the strength of their relationships, and the rest of these things. course, work and profits and GDP, all of those things matter, but they are not the end goal. People's well-being is the end goal. And until we start to differentiate between people's well-being and GDP, or people's well-being and profits, then it's going to be very, very hard to talk about these things which conflict with GDP, which conflict with profits. Of course, you know, it's a huge ask, and potentially impossible ask, I don't know. But the fact that there are, you know, this many people in a room here to talk about an alternative economic agenda and getting out of the liberal straitjacket, and the fact that there's more than a few young people here gives me some hope. So, the final question is, how do you, well, it's probably, I will do this, it's probably worthwhile noting down or just talking a second about this little flyer that you have. So this is the Common Action Project. On the back page of the flyer, on the front page is the poetry, on the back page is a succinct explanation of what an alternative agenda actually means. And the first, you know, people got together, how do we articulate an alternative agenda? Why do we need one? What is this discussion? The first thing that everybody agreed to was, first of all, we need to define a set of principles. If you don't define a set of principles and a set of values, then the rest of it is a great big mess. So I'll just cite some words here. Basic equity of outcomes. Nobody should, like they have been in Sydney, die from exposure because they're homeless. I personally don't think any human being deserves that fate. So it's not equity of opportunity, note, it's equity of outcomes, a basic equity of outcomes. Again, this goes directly to what Frank was talking about the basic income. Recognition of the roles of both markets and government. Another beautiful thing about believing markets are the solution to everything is that you don't need government. You don't need government to do much. In fact, what you need government to do is dissolve itself, is retreat from pretty much anything. And we, you know, one of the best examples of this is the US financial industry, where there was 20 years of retreating. And then there was a global financial crisis. And the man, one of the men who led the whole retreat, Alan Greenspan, sat before a US Congress committee and he was asked about this. And he had to admit, well, we thought that if we just let banks do what they want, they will act in their best interests and everybody will be served. They won't do something silly like crash the financial system and the economy. We were wrong. Markets fail. Markets fail ultimately because, well, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but because they're run by people, and people fail. And they always will. Finally, people's well-being is the ultimate objective of government policy and objective of the economy. It is not the accumulation of ever greater amounts of wealth for anybody, even for the whole population as a whole. I don't think that's the point of society. If, you know, my wife is a psychologist, which comes in handy if you're married to me, but if you ask her, what is it that makes people happy? What is it that people live for? Being a well-trained psychologist, she cites the literature. And the literature says, first and foremost, more than anything else, the thing that makes people happy, things that give people meaning in their lives, is relationships. It is not income. It is not how good is your car or how many bedrooms does your house have. Which actually makes sense. When you look at happiness surveys around the world, they're not that correlated with income. A lot of very poor people are very happy. Strange. Anyway, let me just finish, because I think the question and answer part of these is probably the best part. Let me just finish by saying, I don't think we need a revolution. I don't think we need a fundamental change in how society functions. I think what we need is a very mature and a very open way of thinking about and talking about the challenges that we face, and remembering that those challenges are about all of us. They're about the people that make up society. They're not about the institutions, the centres of power, the pools of wealth, or anything else. All of those things should be secondary to our well-being, all of us, from the wealthiest to the poorest. If that conversation can happen with the Australian people, if we can have leaders, whether they be union, whether they be politicians, whether they be community groups, whether they just be self-appointed people in communities who talk about these issues, who talk about the fact that profit is not happiness, that GDP is not progress, and who discuss alternatives, who discuss what else is possible, what a common sense policy might look like here or there, then I think that's progress. Thank you.